Um, Welcome to another interview held by EFSAS. This time we have with us Mr. Marc Finaud, who is a former French diplomat who has been seconded to the Geneva Centre for Security Policy, GCSP, between 2004 and 2013, and then worked there until 2022 to train diplomats and military officers in arms control, international and human security, while also conducting research in those fields. During his 36-year career as a diplomat, he served in several bilateral postings in the Soviet Union, Poland, Israel, Australia, as well as in multilateral missions to the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, the Conference on Disarmament, the United Nations. He holds a master's degree in international law and political science. He was also a senior resident fellow of the WMD Programme at the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research between 2013 and 2015. Now you're a Swiss citizen, and you remain associated with the Geneva Centre for Security and Policy as a senior advisor and a fellow. And in addition, now you also work as a private consultant. So, Mr. Marc Finaud, thank you for joining us and welcome.
Yeah, thank you for the nice introduction and this invitation, this opportunity to talk about, of course, global issues, but also regional issues. As you mentioned, I've been posted not really in Asian countries, but in a place which now is usually called the Middle East, but it can be also called Western Asia, depending on where you sit. Mm-hmm. And of course, the Middle East is closer to Europe, and therefore it explains actually why we use this term and why in Europe we still have a lot of interest and stakes and involvement in this region, because it's been affected by conflict for many years, and it's also related to the heritage of the colonial period. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, this region is also affected by what's going on east of the Middle East, meaning Afghanistan, India, Pakistan, South Asia. Now we can see that the Middle East for many years was mostly an area of transit for migration from Far Eastern countries. But now it's also both a zone of transit and a zone of emigration to Europe, but it's also affected by phenomenon of migration itself, mostly for people coming from conflict areas. And of course, we have a number of people who are internally displaced persons, IDPs. So we have both refugees and IDPs with a high concentration, because this is a natural phenomenon that you can also find in other parts of Asia, such as Pakistan, because of Afghanistan, where you see a lot of refugees wanting to remain as close as possible to home, because they still nurture the hope of returning home.
And Mr. Finaud, how did, like, we are of course starting off with the Middle East and the refugee problem, and of course how connected it is with South Asia. But first of all, you have been a diplomat for a very, very long time. I even saw some pictures of yours with great world leaders somewhere on the internet. And now you're an academic, or you have been an academic for quite some time with the Geneva Centre for Security Policy. You've engaged with the UN. So how did this come about that you started off as a diplomat, and now you're an academic, you have been a researcher, and now also an expert on nuclear security? So maybe you can tell a little bit about this career of yours, and perhaps even share some anecdotes of your time as a diplomat.
Yes, of course, when I started as a junior diplomat, of course, I had my own academic background, as you said, the master's degrees in international law and then political science, which I think are two approaches of international issues which complement each other. You cannot only stick to a legal approach because sometimes you would ignore the geopolitical considerations. But if you only stick to geopolitics, you lack, again, some aspects which are, in my view, very important, especially if we want to promote multilateralism as the most effective solution to the challenges of today's world. But of course, when I was a diplomat, I was involved in implementing government politics, policies, and therefore my expression, like most countries, diplomats, civil servants, officials, have only a very limited freedom of expression. They have to, when they express themselves publicly, when they write and publish. Now, of course, it's much easier thanks to social media. Obviously, there are some constraints. They have to apply, to promote, to defend national policy, and it's very difficult for them to be critical. And we used to have a minister in government in France who was very vocal, and because he disagreed with the policy at that time of the president, this was under François Mitterrand, especially about the fact that France took part in the first Gulf War as part of the UN sanction coalition to liberate Kuwait. He just resigned, and he mentioned something which now has sort of remain like a mantra in French politics, which I think is applicable everywhere. If you're a government official and you disagree, either you shut up or you resign. So this is what he did. So of course I didn't resign because I disagreed with my government, but on several occasions I had some differences of views, and I realized that the way to promote a different approach, especially on sensitive issues like security, arms control, again, it's very, very difficult. So I was actually fortunate because I worked with senior ambassador in Geneva, my first tour when I was at the conference on disarmament. And this ambassador, of course, was politically close to the president, and he was transferred to be the president's diplomatic advisor. We call them Sherpas because of the G7. But because he had this background, this experience in disarmament, where, of course, he had to apply the official line, which and many times he disagreed with that line. So he had this opportunity, once he joined the office of the president, to convince the president to change the policy. And this is how the president eventually presented to the UN the disarmament plan back in 1991. So France acceded to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, ratified the Biological Weapons Convention, gave a final impulse to the negotiation of the Chemical Weapons Convention, and basically launched a momentum in the disarmament process. So that was a good experience. But then I realized that this was possible only because the ambassador was close to the president, and he managed to convince him to change the policy, but within the system. So I realized that perhaps there would be more opportunities outside the system. And this is why, again, I didn't apply for it, but I was offered this position at the Geneva Centre. First, on secondment, which meant that I was still part of the French Foreign Service. So my freedom of expression was a little bit larger, but not complete. And then when I had a chance, I was offered early retirement, and then I decided to stay and work completely for this organization, because I realized that this is a wonderful opportunity to do both research, training, teaching, to become an academic, but benefit from the experience as an official in working in government. So I had this dual experience, if you like, and of course, being an academic is not only just relying on your degrees, your diplomas, but it's learning every day, teaching and learning at the same time. And this framework where I worked was extremely useful, because this was an international framework. We had people, actually not students, but professionals, diplomats, military officers, international civil servants, people working in NGOs, coming from the whole world with their own profile and experience. So this is very rewarding when you talk to people, and you think you know something about their country or the conflict they are going through, and they actually teach you more. Mm. And also research is something very rewarding, because you can focus on some areas, you can discover new areas. And the most important thing, I think, and this was facilitated from being embedded in this entire international environment in Geneva, in the capital of multilateralism, you realize that all the challenges of today's world are interconnected. Mm-hmm. And that means that no one, including the most powerful country in the world, as this was recognized by the US Secretary of State, Blinken, in the Security Council a couple of years ago, no one can deal with these issues alone. This is what you need: cooperation, you need multilateral diplomacy, multilateral agreements, treaties, etc. Now the problem is, as we know, we are confronted with a sort of return to great power politics, unilateralism or mini-lateralism, small groups like G7 or BRICS, trying to compete with the others. And of course, multilateralism is suffering from that, although it remains, we have evidence of this every day, the best solution and the most effective solution to address our challenges.
And you talk about multilateralism. As you know, we are, of course, an institution which concentrates mostly on the region of South Asia. And we have taken the liberty, of course, because of its influences, to include within South Asia Afghanistan, but also China. While technically, some people might disagree with that. Coming to South Asia, of course, there are some efforts of multilateralism in the shape of the SARC, for example, and now you have India's policy of Southeast Asia, but there are also many obstacles, and you have discussed this previously as well in one of your talks. Can you explain, because many people think that the nuclear powers, India and Pakistan, are in relation to each other, while actually India became a nuclear power in response to China becoming a nuclear power. And then Pakistan became a nuclear power in response to India becoming a nuclear. So can you explain a bit of that history for the people listening, how that worked out?
Yes. First thing to remember is that nuclear proliferation, the number of countries acquiring the bomb increasing, basically, or most likely, was the result of the existing nuclear powers
Mm-hmm.
helping new ones. Yeah, I mean, you may have seen the film Oppenheimer, and there's a hint that even some American scientists helped the Soviets develop their own nuclear program because they didn't want the US to have a monopoly. And of course, the Soviet Union then helped China, and China helped Pakistan, and France helped Israel and South Africa, etc. So this phenomenon of proliferation, which now we consider as very dangerous, and we have to stop it, and there's a treaty to prevent that, it was sort of natural phenomenon for many years. It was, of course, linked to how politics, influence, containment, in the case of the Soviet Union, building big alliances against big powers. And because the initial nuclear powers, especially the two superpowers at that time, the US and the Soviet Union, developed their arsenals on, sort of completely irrational way. Now, we had figures which we don't even grasp today of over 100,000 nuclear weapons being built by those two countries. Of course, then they started reducing, but the peak in the Cold War was like 70,000 for all nuclear powers in 1987. And we still didn't have, we already had, of course, the 5 plus Israel, South Africa that then disarmed. But then we had India, Pakistan, North Korea. And then, of course, those so-called smaller nuclear countries, they had their regional issues. They had their fears of a big neighbor, India versus China, Pakistan versus India. And North Korea also wanting to protect itself from any action from the US, particularly because
do I in your explanation also sense a little bit of course, how it went, but also a little bit of justification in with regard to the perspective from those countries that because the US, America, and the Russia, all these countries were becoming nuclear powers, they also had to?
Exactly. I mean, of course, this is the main challenge when you study arms proliferation, nuclear proliferation. You have to go to the origin of why a country, the government decides to take this step, and usually their motivations are diverse. Of course, for North Korea, it's clear that it's regime survival because it's not a democratic country. Mm-hmm. But in India, India is a democratic country, but they had this fear, this belief that China would become too powerful, and they therefore needed to balance their capacities with nuclear weapons.
Also in the response of the Indochina War, of course.
Exactly. And one of their motivations is certainly the fact that looking at the examples of others. Now, if you have powerful countries that officially claim as part of their defense policy that nuclear weapons are the best weapons, the ultimate weapons, of course, they can't say, which unfortunately they are saying now, do as we tell you, but not as we do. Mm-hmm. So the power of the example is very strong. But again, there are a number of local, regional considerations that, of course, can have a determining factor in the decision. Like France, the case of France, one of the victors of the Second World War, it could have been it was allied of the United States, could rely on defense provided by the United States like the other NATO countries, but now because it had in the leadership, you had this sort of memory, consciously or not, of past defeats. The three wars with Germany in a century. Of course, France lost one and was among the victors in the two world wars, but that did play a role because French territory was invaded, was occupied. And then you had another factor at the beginning of the Cold War, when France, jointly with the UK, because France was at war with the independentist movement in Algeria, and that movement was supported by Nasser in Egypt. France got this alliance with the UK because when Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, France and UK decided to bomb Egypt, to invade Egypt and Suez Canal. And the reaction by the two superpowers at that time, the US and the Soviet Union, was, no, you're crossing a red line. So go back to your old, sort of post-colonial attitude, non-intervention. And the threat was felt very, very vividly in France by the leaders, being in a sense threatened by two nuclear powers, and they had, UK and France had to stop. UK was already advanced in its national nuclear program, but very dependent on the US. And this is where France decided, with the assistance of Israel, and actually this worked both ways, to develop its nuclear program. And of course, when de Gaulle reached into power in government in 1958, he decided to continue that program because this became a sort of synonym of independence, national sovereignty, being part of the group, the club of the big powers. So that, again, I'm not, again, trying to justify, and as you know now, I'm also part of NGOs that...
But it's the explanation why, of course...
Yeah, exactly. So it's interesting to, again, research in history. And again, you can apply the same criteria to other countries as well.
And if you look at South Asia, and of course, there's a history to it, why it happened. It has been a conflict-ridden zone, of course, also due to colonialism, and then regional issues between countries. As far as I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think Pakistan is the only country among these three which has not announced no first use policy. I think the Chinese and the Indians have adapted a no first use policy. And, going forward on that, because this mainly we're talking about nuclear security, but in the backdrop of terrorism, which is in the West, or as we know terrorism today, it's quite a new phenomena. And there have been many voices, for example, the US, I think Secretary Blinken, but even people before him and other people in the West have talked about this phenomena of terrorism in the South Asian region, with these countries being very powerful, but also nuclear countries in two dimensions. One, of course, that how safe are, for example, Pakistan's nuclear arsenal because of the many terrorist organizations in that country. And the second is that how safe, what are the chances of India and Pakistan going to war and then escalating into a nuclear war due to terrorism? So maybe you can shed some light on that.
Yes, yes, of course. When you talk about nuclear issues, you can, of course, focus on regulation, arms control, disarmament. You know, basically everybody agrees on the long-term goal of world without nuclear weapons because people realize they're too dangerous. But there's another aspect which, of course, sometimes is underestimated, which is called nuclear risk reduction. And one doesn't replace the other, because like I support some projects and organizations that advocate, for instance, no first use, but I also advocate the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. I would say it's part of the same concern, because you may may have a good conscience and say, okay, we have a treaty to ban nuclear weapons, but if something bad happens, in the meantime, people who will die and suffer will not be, concerned whether it was legal or not. This will have happened, unfortunately, and this is what I think we should have the priority to prevent. So you have a number of initiatives, proposals, ideas, which have been discussed, floated around for many years, how to reduce the nuclear risk. Now, the nuclear risk is, of course, assessed by experts, not only in nuclear armed countries. You have, for instance, the so-called doomsday clock, which was established immediately at the beginning of the nuclear age by a number of nuclear scientists who created the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. And every year, these scientists, and now this group includes 14 Nobel Prize laureates, so it's not just a bunch of pacifists, there are serious people, and they evaluate the risk of global catastrophe, which of course may occur mostly from nuclear explosion, nuclear war, or accident. And of course, they include now more, so I would say additional risks related to climate change, or terrorism, or global disasters. And they measure this risk, and they have this symbolic clock with the big hand get closer to midnight, which is supposed to be the symbol of the apocalypse, back and forth, depending on whether the risk increases or decreases. So when I was born, back in 1953, the big hand was at 100 seconds to midnight. This was the beginning of the arms race. Then it went back. It was because we had more arms control treaties, more control, etc. But then gradually it got closer, and now we are at 60 seconds. No, sorry, 90 seconds, which is already very close to midnight, because precisely among the risks of nuclear catastrophe, they include the risk of hijacking, looting, illegal use, unauthorized use, accident, loss of nuclear weapons. There have been cases where nuclear weapons were just lost, and there are 6 of them which haven't never been recovered. They are somewhere in an ocean or in a desert. And the more you add actors, like this happened in the past couple of decades, the more you increase also technology, the dependency, reliance on technology, like now artificial intelligence, quantum computing, nanotechnologies. You actually increase the risks. And of course, terrorism was considered as one of the potential risks that nuclear weapons could be stolen, hijacked, detonated by non-state actors, uncontrolled groups. And this is obviously related to the degree of safety and security and order and protection.
How do you assess this risk in South Asia, with the many terrorist groups operating there?
First, this triangle in South Asia with China, India, and Pakistan is very volatile because we have past conflict, potential conflict, and still current conflicts, some of which are related to terrorist attacks. We have seen this between India and Pakistan. Between India and China, it's more
contested boundaries,
borders, definition, etc. And anything can happen when you have the potential of resort to nuclear weapons. You can have an escalation of incidents that can go very fast and get out of control.
Like another Mumbai, for example.
Yes, exactly. Well, you have, like in most countries with nuclear weapons, you have distinction between strategic weapons with long-range missiles, bombers, to attack long distance targets. But you also have so-called tactical nuclear weapons, short range, lower yield, meaning lower destructive power, which is in itself is a form of incentive to use them in war fighting. And this is what is most likely to happen. Perhaps conventional confrontation escalating to the use of short-range tactical nuclear weapons, and then, of course, upgraded to strategic all-out nuclear war. And the risk exists not only in conflict-prone countries, but in other countries, including Western countries versus Russia.
Isn't there a discrepancy in this triangle? For example, I think you write that, and I've read it as well, that the difference is that again, all these countries are different kind of government, rule here. Of course, you have in China, you have the Communist Party, India, democracy, and Pakistan somewhere in between. But as you write as well, and as I've read as well, in India and China, eventually the control of nuclear weapons rests with its political control, while in Pakistan it's military control. So how do you explain this discrepancy in the event of because a military, when faced with war, will go maybe quicker to the nuclear weapon than politicians. So how do you explain this discrepancy?
Yeah, actually the risk exists both ways, because you can have a complete irrational political leader that, we have seen that in the US with Trump, that actually mentioned the use of nuclear weapons, threatening some countries. And fortunately, in most advanced countries, you have a number of barriers, means of identifying who gives the order. It's delegated. It's a chain of command. So, and also in some countries, including Russia, and I think this is rather reassuring. You have a system of separation of nuclear warheads from missiles or bombers, from means of delivery. And this is also the case mostly in China, in India, and Pakistan, because they realize, because of the volatility, you need to be able to assess the risk. And if you, for instance, as it happened with the Soviet Union, you detect a launch of missiles, an attack from the US or from NATO, you need the time to check whether this is true or not. Because if you just retaliate with a nuclear strike, and actually this was a mistake, this is considered as a first strike, and that will trigger a retaliation. So it's a good thing that in China, in India, and Pakistan, there is this extra precaution to keep the weapons or the warheads and the means of delivery separate. The problem is how much, how much distance, how much time you would need to reassemble them. That's difficult to know, but at least there should be encouragement by the international community in this international dialogue for maintaining this type of precaution. That's a means of reducing the nuclear risk. There are other means, of course, like de-targeting, de-alerting, and that
this is, of course, what
yes.
states and multilateralism can do. But you just touched upon previously about non-state actors, of course. So, which again, like that risk in France or that risk in the US is lesser because of the tight controls and not a big terrorism playing field. South Asia, of course, with Afghanistan next door, has been a play field of terrorism for the last 30, 40 years. So that non-state actor risk of terrorism, how much often worry is it in South Asia, and how do you counter it?
Again, there are a number of considerations here. If you take the case of Pakistan, again, if you believe what the government says it's completely under control. So there is no risk of access by non-state actors. So it's a reassuring discourse. Interestingly enough, the United States mostly agrees with that, supports this fairly optimistic approach. But at the same time, of course, when there were serious troubles, terrorist attacks, both in Pakistan and India, the US expressed some concern. In India, there is not so much talk about risk of non-state actors exceeding nuclear weapons, because the control system seems to be fairly tight and secure. The problem is this sequence of events that could start with the terrorist attack, like the case of Mumbai attack, which is attributed to Pakistan, and that could trigger a reaction, escalation, which again can lead to nuclear war. Again, that's certainly part of the risk factors that need to be addressed. So it's not only just the idea of...
so why do you think it didn't happen? Like, for example, when Mumbai happened, why did it, or I think previously when the two countries came at almost a war was in 2001 with the Indian Parliament attack, when the forces, went to the international border and had a standoff. Why do you think it never escalated? Is that due to international intervention? Is that due to thinking on either side, rational thinking that we shouldn't go this far? What do you think worked?
Yes, I think it's a combination of factors. Of course, there was a lot of international concern expressed at that time, trying calls for restraint and avoiding escalation. On both sides, obviously, there is this understanding that it can be a very risky situation, which may get out of hand. Going back to this, for instance, the differences in the arsenals of the various countries, even if they are separate from means of delivery, in the case of Pakistan, and there seems to be some evolution in the nuclear doctrine, which is more difficult to actually assess because of lack of transparency. But there seems to be reference by some military leaders recently to the range, from the whole range. Usually when we talk about short range, when you talk about missiles or bombs to be delivered by aircraft, you talk around 500, 600, 700 kilometers to be safe from your own country, to avoid fallout and negative effect on your own forces. But in this particular case, there was a strange reference to a 0 kilometer range, meaning, Pakistan could even have which was the case in the Cold War in NATO, nuclear mines or nuclear shells, or very small devices, but are still nuclear and can, of course, cause a lot of damage, including to your own forces or civilians. So that's, again, that can add to the risk, because the tendency is, once you have the whole panoply and you say, okay, we can use these weapons just like conventional weapons, then it's very difficult to stop the escalation.
Okay, and that is, of course, in terms of terrorism provoking action from two states. Now, what about, because many terrorist groups have had the ambition to overthrow governments in these various countries, mostly of them Islamist terrorist organizations. And again, it's perhaps a far-fetched idea, but some of these groups have also expressed the ambition to get hold of nuclear weapons. And I'm not saying, because as you just said, the military in Pakistan has expressed that they are very much in control, and the international community seems to be satisfied with that. But then again, as many of these, or some of these countries have, of course, acquired nuclear weapons on the black market. North Korea, and of course, there are some allegations towards Pakistan as well, Iran. So what are the chances of terrorist groups, whether in this region, Afghanistan, Pakistan, if they don't get it from, overthrowing governments, but they get it on the black market? See Afghanistan. Taliban is currently in power. If we just turn that around and we say, suddenly the Taliban or the TTP is in power in Pakistan, then it's suddenly a terrorist group running a country with nuclear weapons. So what are those chances? Also on the black market, of course.
Sure. No, as I said, these are, of course, factors of instability, of vulnerability, of risks. It's very, very difficult to speculate what could happen. We have some experience. Countries in the region have their own experience, lots of casualties, fatalities dealing with terrorist attacks, but you have a whole diversity of motivations. Some terrorist groups are purely religiously motivated, some are separatist groups, some are, have very, very narrow agendas. They can create a lot of trouble and a lot of victims. But they even, a huge country like India, which is suffering a lot of terrorist attacks internally, still remains fairly strong system of government, and so there's no risk of immediate collapse. But as you could say, there are some risks that some smuggling, black market transactions can occur. I would say this actually is also related to civil nuclear power. Nuclear energy is also used for civilian power to generate electricity or research, and this is where probably these facilities are the most vulnerable, not only in India and Pakistan, but also in Western countries, and when you can see what's happening in Ukraine with power plants, being in the middle of war zone, that shows that again, nuclear energy as a whole, as a means of energy, whether it's used for peaceful purposes or military purposes, is still very dangerous. So what is more likely to happen, and this is happening actually, there is a database in the International Atomic Energy Agency, which publishes data, of course, reported by member states on cases of seizures by customs, border control of nuclear or radioactive material that can come from civilian power plants, hospitals, research facilities, labs, etc. Now, these quantities, unfortunately, are very small. I mean, even if the number of incidents is fairly high, the quantities are small, then they could, at worst, help create what is called a dirty bomb. Mm-hmm. And I don't like this term because it implies that nuclear bomb is clean. Yeah. But this just means to spread radioactive material using conventional explosive and not cause mass casualties, but create panic, havoc, huge cost in decontamination, etc. So these may be new factors of risks that we have to address.
And then, that's the terrorism part. You, of course, talked about the Cold War and where it all started. There seems to be a new Cold War, mainly between maybe the US and China. And I think China is also engaged in a lot of hot wars within its region. You have Taiwan, of course. You have the Xinjiang province, the Uyghurs, the minority there. You have, of course, its issues with India. So how do you see this panning out, this new kind of Cold War? With, of course, many analysts believe that China is a different animal than the Soviet Union.
Yes, of course, each case is different. The current context is, certainly can include some similarities with past experience with the Soviet Union, but because we're dealing now with of course, a new superpower economically with huge population, but at the same time, we realize that sometimes this idea, the fear of China becoming a new superpower and imposing its will to the rest of the world is a little bit exaggerated. And this is legitimate in a sense because the United States always needed an ideal enemy. But fortunately, there is some diversity of opinion within the US. You have, including among the conservatives, actually, you have some people who are reluctant to start to react to this rise of China by means of increasing armament, increasing military presence, increasing confrontation. We know that economically both big powers are interdependent. No one can actually do without the other. So there's no risk of economic war. There is some form of competition, but they know that each country needs the other. And from a military point of view, sometimes in the US you have this idea that it's again.
But do you think it has to do with the fact that the US or the West, and in some cases quite rightfully so, but considers China more expansionist than the Soviet Union?
Of course, it is a risk, which again is is assessed objectively, because you can see what China is after, especially in South China Sea. You just want to make sure that there is no obstacle, no foreign presence that could be an obstacle to its freedom of navigation, because it's so dependent on export and import from the rest of the world. So that's its main motivation. Taiwan, I would say, is a specific case which fortunately so far has been treated peacefully, and I hope it will remain so. And I don't think, again, it would be appropriate, especially for some parties in the US, to advocate use of force in a preemptive way, for instance. That could only lead to disaster. But also, we have to be objective, realistic, sober. When you compare the military might of the United States with, first military budget in the world, $800 billion, the second largest nuclear arsenal in the world after Russia, huge conventional forces, 800 military bases throughout the world, which China, which is, of course, now in the increase, is increasing its capacities, building new silos for missiles. But even if it's double its current number of its arsenal, that would still represent 10% of the US arsenal for a population 4 times larger. So again, we have to put things into balance and perspective. And the problem is that, of course, there was a good bilateral framework established after the Cuban Missile Crisis between US and Soviet Union because of the bilateral risk, the risk of bilateral conflict and escalation. And not much has been done to integrate China into a collective approach. Now, Trump has tried, but this was bound to fail. It was
and now it seems even more difficult
yes.
after the Ukraine.
It's never completely lost. First, again, I believe in the power of the example. For instance, you have a treaty like the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. It's been signed by the US, but not ratified. So China, again, signed but didn't ratify. So it's just waiting for the US to ratify. Of course, it's a domestic political issue. They need the votes in the Senate, but no president has really tried to lose some political capital by doing that, by ratifying. And then you need to convince, of course, if China ratifies, that will be easier to convince India, Pakistan, North Korea to join. And then that means that the treaty will enter into force and China will be part of this mechanism. Now, all countries with nuclear weapons, the 9, so including India, China, Pakistan, and North Korea and Israel, they are all members of the Conference on Disarmament here in Geneva. But of course, there's not been any consensus, any agreement. You have the P5, of course, happen to be permanent members of the Security Council, and therefore they consider themselves as having some extra privileges, and they've made some statements which are useful, saying, for instance, that what Gorbachev and Reagan said, that nobody can win a nuclear war, therefore no nuclear war should be fought. If all 9 countries would say that, that would certainly create better, probably better control of the risk. And if they all accepted no first use, again, it would be better for all of us.
Yeah, but many of these countries have, of course, acquired nuclear wars to stalemate positions between a smaller and a bigger country. And you talked in the beginning, and I'm coming to the end of this interview, so I would like to go towards the beginning you started off with, which is of course the multilateralism. And how do you see, for example, this what you were discussing about all these countries coming together at a platform and taking forward the agreements that are already there, about no first use policy and other things. So how do you see, for example, the various small multilateral platforms which are already there? Do you see them actually, providing a foundation to get there, or actually hampering a foundation? Like you have the Quad, you have the SARC, you have what is it, the BRICS, I guess. Then you have, of course, this the BRI, which is China's project, but many countries are included. So do you think these multilateral platforms, whether economical, military, or political, do they actually hamper it, or do they provide foundation?
They can play a very useful role in what I would call peer pressure, peer review. Among like-minded countries, it's easier than within the UN, where you have so much diversity. And what I notice, of course, that now there is this gap, this division, this cleavage between countries which are party to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, so they agreed not to acquire nuclear weapons, but at the same time they believe that more should be done because the nuclear powers didn't fulfill their pledge of disarmament, and that's why they adopted the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Mm-hmm. Now, we know that this treaty is rejected by all the nuclear armed countries, so not only the P5 plus India, Pakistan, North Korea, Israel, and their allies, NATO allies, etc. So in a smaller format like BRICS, for instance, Brazil and South Africa signed the treaty. So they can demonstrate that their security is not diminished. On the contrary, they feel confident that they're part of a broader community. Actually, half of the members of the General Assembly signed the treaty. So it's not, just a few isolated countries. So again, in ASEAN, in SARC, in other frameworks, they can show that by joining this treaty, not only their security is not threatened, but on the contrary, they feel more confident and that they will actually benefit. I mean, take countries like Kazakhstan. In Kazakhstan, for many years was the testing site of Soviet nuclear weapons. So huge disaster, lots of casualties. Now they're leading the way to sign the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the Treaty on Prohibiting Nuclear Tests, the regional nuclear weapon-free zone. Australia, which suffered also from the nuclear test by the UK, could also join and show the example. It did so. And there is a treaty of also a nuclear weapon-free zone in the South Pacific, which was against French nuclear testing. But now Australia is, of course, still not considering becoming a nuclear country, but acquiring nuclear-powered submarines, which is a step, towards more proliferation. So again, in these regional frameworks, there could be more promotion, more advocacy for nuclear disarmament.
And of course, probably these countries will say that nuclear disarmament should be preceded by regional conflicts first being solved. So it's
actually, they sort of fuel each other in the sense that sometimes nuclear weapons give countries this self-confidence that they can attack their neighbors, like Russia did with Ukraine. But at the same time, you cannot get rid of nuclear weapons unless you do something about the root causes of conflict.
And you have, of course, and this is my last question, to just, and it perhaps in the largest multilateral forum there is, and you have worked a lot with the United Nations, of course. So what role does the UN and its various arms, including the UN Security Council, but also the UN Human Rights Council, what role can the UN play? And do you think it has actually not played enough of a role?
Well, the UN is a framework. It's an organization of states. So it's run by states. And so it depends very much on what states do and decide, what their mutual relations influence is. Of course, we can see the Security Council is paralyzed by the veto of the big powers. But the General Assembly represents where democracy was called the Parliament of Man. And this is where things can be done, agreements can be negotiated. This has been the case on many issues: human rights, climate change, development. We have the SDGs, which really is sort of common heritage, where all states actually do work together to solve the problems of this planet.
Yeah. Probably the UN has, of course, become a lot more of a political platform than actually working towards the betterment of everyone, irrespective of political considerations. Mr. Finaud,
it was always both.
Of course. Mr. Finaud, thank you very much for this very enlightening, conversation on a subject which is overlooked too often, and I think people don't understand much about it. We of course have heard those stories of nuclear war and the things that happened in Japan, but we have no realization of how these things, of course, between states work. And it was very interesting to hear from you these nuances of how things develop between countries. And I hope indeed that your work with the GCSP and the other organizations, that someday we might live in a nuclear-free world.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.